Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee for Capital Expenditures. Today is February 29th, 2024. And on tonight's agenda, as we've continued to go through the capital needs inventory that we discussed, trying to assess the city's capital needs for its appropriations for next fiscal year. The main event this night is discussing the city's fleet needs. However, before getting there, I did want to, I'll share my screen, a couple things. I did have a few things I wanted that were added on just as supporting materials from the previous meetings. Let's see if you can see that. That's the capital needs inventory. Mr. Lieberman had some questions on the inventory that he submitted to us separately. And Rich and his group responded to them. So I posted those under there. That's just sort of an FYI if you're interested in looking. And also, if you recall, when we had an earlier conversation about when we were talking about parks, I remember there was one question, where's Barrett Park? And some of the information related to particular projects were saying, where in the city is this particular item located? Well, I got back in touch with PDA, the good folks there, the mapping agency over there, and they put together a map and some with some identified projects there for our critical needs, so you can see where most of these things are located geographically within the city of St. Louis. So that's just sort of a reference. I will, as we get to the start talking about the fleet, I'll post this in the chat just so you have the link. If you're interested to reference the map of the items that we were talking about of our critical capital needs. But separate from that, and going back to our critical needs, our capital needs inventory, as I mentioned, we're talking about fleet, which is the last item on our category H on our capital needs inventory. Actually, I should amend that. Part of it also includes police vehicles and fire vehicles from D and E. But we have Chris Amos from the city's, from the city's equipment services division, working also under Rich Bradley, who maintains those vehicles and provides for us recommendations on fleet, which one's a priority for replacement. And so he will be the main presenter this evening. And so what I'd like to do is, and yes, I will expand this. I know how tiny it is. I'll expand this and give this to, turn it over to Rich and Chris, and you can proceed however you like.
Well, let me just, thanks, Paul. Let me just say good evening, everyone. Let me do a little quick introduction. So Chris Amos is the Commissioner of Equipment Services, and he oversees the maintenance and capital purchases of the vehicles here in the inventory. He does not assign take-home vehicles. He does not determine the specific operational needs of a department. That is determined by those departments, and they work in conjunction with Chris on the capital needs list. Also, a question was asked about vehicles, and so we keep a very, very extensive database on these vehicles, when they're maintained, how they're taken care of, and particularly the model year, the mileage on them, as well as any crashes or damages or things like that that are done to them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to tell you all about vehicles in the city fleet tonight. So Chris? Chris, you're on mute if you're talking.
Okay. You there, Chris?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, we got you.
Okay, good. I thought I hit the mark.
I didn't know where you wanted to start. I'd like
to start with the fire and the police page, just the piece about vehicles.
All right, we'll pull that up.
I just want to mention that mostly what I want to talk about is public works vehicles, because they're a little more difficult to understand what the need is.
Okay, this is the section from the second page of it would be category D, which was the fire department. There was that second page where we talked about fire department vehicles.
Right. So in this one, the department request was a little higher than what condition of the fleet would dictate was critical. So based on age, there was over $6 million worth that needed to be replaced on a critical basis. But based on other criteria like condition of the vehicles and the usage pattern that the fire department has for them, didn't need quite that many. It comes down to they have a need for one more hook and ladder, which is only a 107-footer as opposed to a normal 125-footer, because that's the longest one that will fit in the house in the district where it's needed. And then it includes a Quint 75, which is a 75-foot ladder that has 4 other systems on it for foam and water is why it's called a Quint. And it was just to replace one that was 6 years old that was totaled in the flood we had a year ago, October. We have a request into FEMA to get something back on that, but it's not going to replace the vehicle. So that one needs to be replaced. And then there's $100,000 in that $4 million that is for bringing back 4 model year 2000 75-foot Quints so the ladders will be enabled on the backup units. Like anything else, the critical vehicles have got backups. Sometimes with things like sweepers and ambulances and fire trucks, you may need half as many backups as you have in the front line, or even 1-to-1, like in the case of an ambulance or a sweeper, something that's very difficult to keep running. So I just wanted you to understand that that's the piece that was in the fire. It's basically 2 large trucks that cost over $2 million a piece, and then fixing 4 old ones so the ladders work again, which would be a capital refurbishment as opposed to just a repair. So that's all I had to say about that one. So you want to entertain questions by section or at the end?
Yeah, well, I was just going to add, and you did mention this a bit. Typically, I mean, we've invested quite a bit in the fire department's fleet in the last few years, in the last capital allocations. Typically, you would have a frontline vehicles. They'd be on the front line for about 10 years or so, and then they need to be replaced. And those, when they're replaced, then they are moved back to reserves. And the reserves are then, the older reserves are then moved out of the fleet. So that's how that goes. But the reserves do need to be functional, and that's where some of the refurbishments come in to ensure that we do have those functional reserves. Is that, did I misstate anything there, Chris?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Okay. Okay, well, yeah, we'll take a question here. Oh, that's just a suggestion that anyone who's not speaking, please mute themselves because we're having some background noise. Thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no questions on this, let's move to the police.
Okay. Leroy, I hear you. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah. Where do we store those reserve items, reserve trucks and vehicles?
Chris, you hear that?
The reserve units are stored. They're all stored inside because they're too easy to steal from. The brass and worry about the condition of the vehicle. So they stay inside the secured facility at some location. Now, some of them are kept in the backside of bigger houses. 3 of them are kept over at the central garage where we repair them, so that when a vehicle comes in that's broken, the crew will change out their tools and everything on the truck they get out of, put it on the reserve truck, and then take it out and use it for service. So we had a minimum of downtime for that house. And then there is the old garage, which is downtown off of Spruce and Tucker, where they've got room for, I think it's 7 or 8 of the larger apparatus, and so that's where the rest of them are stored.
Okay, good. That was my question. I just wanted to make sure that they were in a location where they were indeed safe and secure.
Yep. We're with you on that one. They're too valuable to leave around where people can mess with them.
Right.
Do we crank them up every now and then, even though we don't use them? Do we crank them up just to keep them exercised?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand all of that.
I said, do we crank them up every now and then just to keep them exercised?
Oh, they
though-
get used. There's probably not 2 weeks that goes by that all 12 of the reserves don't end up in active service at some point. We've got 8 bays where we repair trucks. So 8 of them are always out doing the repairs. And of course, some of those repairs are services that only take 2 or 3 hours, and then they're back. But the majority of them are going to be out for 3 to 5 days, depending upon how critical the system is, like if it's a pump or a ladder, or it is something electronic with the diesel engine. It definitely turns into days, and so they all get exercised at least 2 times a month, some of them more often than that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Then we'll go to, this is the end of the believe, police vehicles. You want to talk about them?
Yeah, briefly. The police department vehicles have escalated in cost over the last 20 years fairly steadily, and then have gone up, 15% or so just in the last couple of years. And this is pretty typical across the board for all vehicles. And the bigger they are, the more they've been going up, and they take longer to get delivered. Well, the ARPA Review Committee and this committee, when we discussed the ARPA, helped considerably with that. And so the shortfall had produced about 30 or 35 vehicles in the patrol class and about 50 in the detective class that were behind being replaced, to the point where they weren't very dependable, even though I've got 35 people in the garage that do nothing but work on the emergency light duty vehicles. And so the patrol vehicles have been taken care of with the last 2 years worth of capital money, supplementing the general fund that Paul and Budget Division fund during the normal budget process. But the piece that we still need to shore up is the detective vehicles. And these vehicles don't go home. They're used by 2 or 3 shifts of officers every day, 7 days a week. And they're sedans rather than marked Tahoes. So most of them are unmarked so they can do surveillance work without being overly obvious. But they are not take-home vehicles by any means. So we need 42 of those to supplement what the police department's able to buy out of their operating budget out of capital, and that comes up to the 1.3 million. Now, the scout vehicles, which is what what the police department calls a marked patrol vehicle, those are the Tahoe SUVs in general, which is the most dependable vehicle in that category of vehicles. And those are the needed category, which means that we have 2 million of those that are at least 2 years past due and up to 5 years past due, but are not in the critical category. The criticals were taken care of with 3.5 million and 2 million in capital for the last couple of years. So that's why we're not in too bad a shape right there. So we're almost caught up with the police department. Now, that is based upon the operational needs of the department now. As many of you know, staffing within the police department there are a lot of vacancies. And so, like with a lot of parts of the city we'll talk about, if they had full staffing, then they would be sorely in need of vehicles to go with those staff members. But for their current manpower, this is the only part of the request for their fleet that needs to go. They have about 700 vehicles total. And so 42 of them would like to fill in with capital.
All right.
That's all.
First question from Katie. Let me go back up. I just lost it here. What steps are police taking to address the reckless driving and general abuse of the Tahoes?
Well, it happens. Police vehicles have got a high crash rate. There's no doubt about it. And it doesn't have anything to do with it being a Tahoe, but I understand you talk about marked patrol cars. They, just like every department in the city that has vehicles, they have a safety advisory committee that reviews all crashes. They take the police reports that are filled out there. They take the insurance documents if the third party's involved. The city councilor supervises things if there's injuries, and they determine whether or not there was a city employee, including a police officer, that contributed to the crash. And certainly there are a few that I couldn't explain to you why we have a problem. I know we haven't had one that was mechanical based in well over a decade. Since anything like a brake failure or something like that's caused a crash. But the other reason that so many police vehicles get involved in crashes, is usually serious ones, is because citizens frequently will run stoplights, and it's just not just city vehicles that get hit, but a lot of the major crashes for police vehicles and for ambulances too is getting T-boned at an intersection. Frequently they'll flip over. Frequently they'll get totaled. The new Tahoe at this point, fully marked with all the equipment on it, is $64,000. All of them on the street are at least $50,000 because they're all 7 to 9 years old, the oldest ones. So I certainly can't answer the question about whether or not police officers are being as careful as they can be or not, but I can say that there are many of the accidents, and I see the accident reports before we do the repairs, where it's a case of the vehicle being parked slightly in the driving lane to protect the officer and citizens who pulled over on the side of the road and break down or get a ticket or something. And even if a $64,000 vehicle gets totaled in a crash, it's better than somebody getting killed by the same driver that wasn't paying attention to the parked car. So those vehicles provide the protection to the people who are at the scene. They are clearly marked, and they have reflective markings even for night, and they all have lights on them to make them more visible. And yet we probably lose at least a dozen total a year in crashes where the vehicle's not moving at all. And then there are others that happen during pursuits and during regular patrol missions that I can't really speak to. But we do get a lot of interest on that particular subject. We get sunshine law requests occasionally asking about the number of crashes and the cost of crashes and all that. And my department does track all of that. We know what everything costs. We know how many there were. And so whenever we're asked to supply that information, we do.
Okay, a couple more. Are the sedans Impalas?
They can be, and they're always going to be what's considered a full size now. It used to be considered mid-size before 2000, 4-door sedans. And there are some that are crossovers that are a lot less expensive than a Tahoe would be. And so there's something that's going to cost about $30,000 to $32,000 fully equipped with the radio and the computer stand and the lights and sirens and all that stuff. They don't have exterior markings, but they have everything else a patrol car has. So there's something of that type. And we have looked into using other types of vehicles, saying we recommend, and the police department decides what will work for operationally for their needs. So we've looked into some hybrid models. We've looked into some electric models. We've looked into switching over to pickup trucks, you know, for some cases, like one of the DOT vehicles that handles interstate highways and trucks was bought with federal funds. That is a Ford F-150 Lightning electric pickup truck. Been in service for about a year, and it's performing well. So we do try different things, but most of the time we are a vehicle of the Impala or something like the Impala.
Okay. And the follow-up to that is one related. You mentioned that the critical need of the 42 is related to a certain staffing level of the department. And the question is that 42 request related, given the number of vacancies police have, do we need the 42, or is that 42 taking that into account, the vacancies?
The 42 is to meet the operational needs that the police have with their current staffing levels. So
okay.
If they were full strength, they'd need more vehicles than they have.
Okay. I thought you had said that, but I just want to make sure, and that was what the question was. So, okay. What's the insurance policy on these vehicles?
Well, the city is self-insured.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
By the city councilor's office. So if a determination is made that the city or its employees are at fault, then the city councilor's office settles those claims. And sometimes they end up in lawsuits, and sometimes they end up in settlements, just like they would if it was our own vehicles, our own insurance. I know they have a lawyer and 2 staff people that stay busy doing that with all the different types of claims, not just vehicles, but we keep them busy with just vehicles probably half the month. Let's see. What was the other? Oh, the question.
The other question, especially given the number of recent crashes reported, is there any conflict with department policy regarding what information is publicly shared, what's paid to businesses, residents affected by crashes, et cetera? You had mentioned requests on that earlier.
Yeah, all the information that I have, which is all the facts about how many vehicles, what they are, how much the damage was, how long the vehicle wasn't available because it was wrecked, all that is all publicly available. I don't think most people would care about that, but like I said, we've had 2 sunshine law requests in the last month.
Right.
That we've run the reports for and provided the data. There was one last year that was similar. So people are obviously concerned about that, especially when you see those types of things on the news, and rightly so, ask questions about it.
Right.
I'm not particularly concerned about it just because I've been doing this for 40 years, and every place I've been, military, county, city, it's always a problem with public safety vehicles being involved in an inordinate amount of crashes. Doesn't really speak to the way their vehicles are being used so much as it speaks to where those vehicles have to be.
Okay. Okay, question. Why do police need the huge Tahoes as opposed to a regular vehicle, especially given the danger these oversized vehicles present even beyond the police force?
Good question. In fact, that's a question that Paul has asked me many times over the years as we switch from cars to Tahoes. Well, the Tahoes look like they're a beast, but the fact is they're on a half-ton chassis truck. They are basic vehicles. They have rubber floors and vinyl seats, and there's nothing fancy about them. They sit up higher. They have the I-pillar, which is that piece that holds the windshield in and rakes back to the the ceiling, the roof of the vehicle, is fairly vertical compared to a lot of other vehicles. As vehicles become more and more aerodynamic to improve fuel economy, that has been sliding down. And the reason I mention that is because it makes it difficult to get in and out of a vehicle, especially if you are a larger than average, meaning taller than average police officer, and especially if you have all that equipment around your waist that you have to carry in and out of the vehicle. So one of the major concerns that led to trying the Tahoes to start with was the police union, who was concerned about officers' safety because of the time it took to get in and out of the vehicle. So it does have a wide opening. The seat does sit back pretty far, even if you have to leave people in the back seat. And it good egress and ingress. And so that's the main reason why they are. As far as cost is concerned, of the few pursuit rated vehicles that there are, being the ones that are designed to run 24/7 and can go high speed if they need to, those vehicles, the Tahoe is actually the cheapest base price of it. So that $64,000 I quoted you is the current price, and $12,000 of that is the extra equipment and the markings that go on it. But still, it's more expensive than it used to be. And it's about $8,000 more than a car would be. But the problem is the car is not really suitable for patrol use, according to the police department. And right now, there is no sedan that is pursuit rated. So you have to buy the same kind of vehicle that you or I could go to a dealership and pick up today, and it wouldn't be able to hold up to idling the way that the Tahoe does. It wouldn't be able to brake as quickly and turn without sliding like the Tahoe does. So it seems extravagant, but the fact is it is a basic vehicle. It provides excellent safety. And we've had some crashes that if they'd have been in something smaller, I'm sure that there would have been some much more serious injuries and maybe some fatalities. You got to remember back when the police departments used sedans mostly, they were using LTDs and the Chevrolet, the vehicles were about 3.5 feet longer than they are today. They had the big wide openings and the big doors, and they had all the pursuit rated equipment with the special tires, special brakes, and all that kind of stuff. So those vehicles are really all that's left because people don't buy them commercially anymore, so they quit making them. So the police have very few choices about what they can and can't buy. So I personally recommend the Tahoe as the best one for them to buy. And the other thing about that is that the cars don't have the traction that a four-wheel drive SUV does. And now that the four-wheel drives in that class of vehicle are so much more bulletproof than they used to be, no pun intended, then they're able to get around during a bad ice or snowstorm. You may remember when the Pope visited several years ago, we had a bad storm. There were over 80 police cars that couldn't be on the street because they didn't have good enough traction to be out there. The only ones that worked were the Tahoes that we had.
Okay, we got a number of questions. Let me get through there. And Ivy, I see your hands raised. So let me get through some of these chats first, and then I'll get to you quickly. Well, this is Katie's. Personally, has a statement. I personally can't support the purchase of additional patrol vehicles until proactive steps are taken to address reckless driving. I personally have witnessed those vehicles run red lights without sirens or sirens and hitting law-abiding traffic. Yeah, I think that's an operational concern. And yeah, I so noted there. Second and third, agree with Katie. Can you explain once again what happens to retired vehicles? This is from Leroy. Do you remove all ancillary equipment, computer stands, radios, spotlights, hoses, ladders, etc., I assume that equipment is reused on newer and other vehicles?
Yeah, that's largely true. So let me handle that in the order they were asked. What do we do with the used vehicles? Well, first of all, we operate the patrol vehicles 7 to 9 years. They're 24/7 vehicles, 3 shifts a day operating those vehicles. And so at the point when we get rid of them around the 7-year mark, they have actual close to 300,000 miles on them, usually on their second engine and transmission. And they have got idle time that would be another 100,000 miles worth of engine time, depending upon what kind of patrol duty they're on. But they do spend some time stopped, and they keep it idling when that happens most of the time. So when the vehicles come out of patrol use, they are pretty worn out. But if we replace 50 or 60 vehicles at a time, there might be 10 or 12 of them that still have some life left in them. And we put those in lower intensity uses. So like building inspectors, home service nurses in the health department, onesie twosies out there for transporting, running mail, that kind of thing. So if they're low mileage, but they're old age, and we're having trouble getting parts for them in that, which is what usually the problem is, then we'll put them into a second use. So by the time they actually leave city service, they are thoroughly shot. Most of them get towed to get sold.
Okay.
The few that survive that process get auctioned.
Okay, next, yeah, I'm trying to get through it. How many of the Scout cars being requested are replacing the new SUVs they just bought with ARPA funds? I don't think those are on this list, but go ahead.
Well, they're not on there. The ARPA funds ended up buying 54. We thought we were going to get 60, but the price went up. And then we bought another 35 last year with capital funds that wasn't ARPA. So just ARPA was used for 1 year. And those were just supplemental. So there were also vehicles of that type being bought with the department funds out of the operating budget. So these 40 some odd, well, the Tahoes are on there that I hadn't needed, but not the critical category. Those
so basically Chris, I was going to jump in. Basically, the Scout cars are not being requested here in this. You're talking about those sedan cars that were detectives, right?
Right.
Okay.
Nothing that we're questioning now is anything that we bought in the last 7 years.
Okay.
So they're older vehicles that are on their way out, and every year you have to replace a percentage of the fleet just to keep them reliable on the road.
Okay. JP mentions it's been reported these SUVs may be too difficult to drive by officers. As someone responsible to fleet purchases, what is your assessment of vehicle maneuverability relative to other vehicles available for purchase?
Well, again, that is a department policy issue. And so if the department, with consultation with the police officers union, decided they wanted to try something else, I wouldn't be the problem. We would try it and see what happens. Normally we'll get a demo vehicle and let several people drive it. Like we've done that with Dodge products and Ford products in the past, trying to find something that might be better than what we've been buying. So it's a matter of personal taste in most cases. I can tell you that the officers that I see at the shop don't say these things. They say that they like the size and, get in and out of them quickly as the main purpose of them. But again, regardless of whether we buy cars or SUVs or special, powered hybrids or whatever, they have to be pursuit rated if they're in a patrol, a scout mission, in order to hold up. And the only choice there is right now is the Tahoe, and that was true for last year as well. So unless the manufacturers start producing something else because the public also wants to buy them, we don't really have much choice.
Okay, Ivy, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to circle back to something that was said actually several minutes ago, but and I understand that, emergency vehicles are going to see an unusual amount of wear and tear and be involved in more collisions, but I just want to make it very explicit that what we're witnessing right now and what we're referring to are police cars that are crashing into immobile buildings. And that doesn't fall under that normal scope. And I just, even if this money right here is not going to directly replace, those damaged vehicles, I think, and again, I know, Mr. Amos, I appreciate the fact that you are not in charge of operations side of the SLMPD, but I think that that's something that we should be really explicit about what we're talking about here, is that this is not a normal thing that we are witnessing and being asked to fund with our tax dollars.
Well, you're certainly right about that. I mean, I watched the news too, and I saw the two on the news that you saw, and it's difficult to understand, but it is the safety departments for each one of the departments to review it to determine what the cause of the crash was, and they do discipline in every department in the city for egregious activities like that. So, I know one of the officers said he saw a dog, but I didn't see one in the video. So if it turns out that there was no plausible explanation for how that crash happened or why it happened, I would assume that the appointing authority for that department, in this case the police chief, would take disciplinary action. It won't change the fact that I still have to fix the vehicle, and it won't change the fact that I still have to replace it if it's totaled. So the money's still spent, but at least somebody's not taking care of taxpayer property. I'm a taxpayer too. Then we want to see them held accountable. And unfortunately, it's not just police cars. It's sweepers and tractors and trash trucks and dump trucks. And I mean, I could talk to you for hours about the things I see, but it would probably make you have as bad a headache as I have.
Thank you, Chris. Todd, did you have your hand raised? Mr. Irons?
I just wanted to ask in regards to the purchasing of the vehicles, are there any dealerships or women-owned dealerships?
Sorry, I didn't hear much of that. Could you
Yeah,
say
you're
it again,
breaking in
please?
it. You're breaking up.
Sorry. Yeah. Is that better?
We
No,
can't.
sure.
We didn't get most of that.
I'm getting about every third word. Maybe you could type it, and I could answer it from that. If we can't get your microphone working right, I certainly want to answer your question.
Are you able to go into the chat and just type it up? Okay, we can give you some time to do that. So those are the fire and the police categories. Chris, did you want to just go ahead and start on the other category?
Vehicles. Yeah, I do. I just want to look at the totals on the top of that report, and then I'd like for you to show the summary report, the pivot table.
Oh yeah. Let me another item here, which let's see, do I have it? Let's see here.
32 pages of vehicle list is just too much for anybody to have to look at. So we summarized it in a way that hope it'll be more clear.
go ahead and start talking about those
Okay.
numbers. And I'll pull that up because I posted that. What Chris is referencing is that anytime we talk about vehicles, it's always useful to have, when I see a request for a replacement of vehicles, they say, oh, we need 5 dump trucks or whatever. It always is always helpful to have, for context purposes, the entire fleet, so you know what portion of the fleet we're talking about and how these particular vehicles fit into the overall fleet of either that department or overall citywide. And so, to answer that question, work with Chris, and that we have also posted online, and I will post that link as well, and we'll pull it up as Chris talks, of the overall city fleet and the list, which has by vehicle, by age, and all of that give us that idea. So if you go ahead you can go ahead and start, Chris, and I'll find it on my screen, and I'll pull it up as we go.
Okay. So the non-emergency vehicles, meaning the not police and not fire, comes under the heading of other city vehicles. So this is mostly public works vehicles, and it includes the majority of the fleet that we operate. We've got 3,700 vehicles total, not all of which are capital size. So you don't see the complete list here. Some of the things, you know, are out front mowers and only cost $12,000, so they're not on the capital list. So on the sheet here, though, the first one I have is about the electric vehicle program. We're taking baby steps on the electric vehicle program, mostly because our study that we did with an independent consultant in Ameren UE identified 240 vehicles that we could convert to being electric when we replaced them, and then over the life of the vehicle, they ended up costing the same or less. But that only applies to light duty stuff like pickups and vans. It doesn't even apply to the sedans because we have very few of them in the city fleet. But in order to take advantage of that, the first thing you have to do is you have to provide infrastructure for a place for those vehicles to be recharged. So essentially what we're doing is putting in a whole nother fuel system. So we have a fuel system for gasoline vehicles and for diesel vehicles, and we have commercial backup for that at stations where we get a discount off the pump and pay for those. But if we're going to go into electric vehicles, then we have to invest in electric infrastructure. And so far, we have spent $400,000 of the $600,000 that was allocated previously in the capital program in order to put the first stations up to the major parking areas for overnight recharging for them. We're getting ready with the remainder of that money to put in a test electric fleet for the police department, both for investigative services and for detective vehicles, which those vehicles are included in that 40 that we're requesting now. But the incremental cost for those would be included in the $120,000, so that basically we have to pay for the vehicle a little more upfront in order to save the fuel and maintenance over the life of the vehicle. And so far, we've had very good luck with the electric vehicles. They are pretty much bulletproof from a mechanical standpoint. Batteries are still a little bit touchy with how fast you recharge them. But other than that, haven't got any concerns about those. Of course, if you wreck an electric one early, then you don't have it long enough to pay back for one's fuel savings. But it certainly does produce much less emissions, even with the cost and the pollution involved in producing electricity. And so we would like to continue to make some progress on that as it makes economic sense to do so. Because if we replace a vehicle with gasoline with another gasoline one, it'll be another 10 to 15 years before we get the opportunity to replace it again. So as those low-hanging fruit vehicles are come to be replaced, we want to go ahead and replace them with electric vehicles. We can only do that if we can put the infrastructure out there. So that's what those first two line items are about.
Hey, Chris, and this is just for my benefit as well, and maybe anyone else is interested. When we talk about the charging infrastructure, there's been a lot of talk about changing the standards on structure, the infrastructure, and I understand like the Tesla vehicles seem to be the model everyone's going to be switching to. So when we talk about spending on the infrastructure for charging, are we taking into consideration what the industry standard, where that's going to be? I mean, it's sort of like the old Betamax VHS debate.
Yeah, it is kind of like that, except that, you know, when you're talking about Tesla, you're talking about fast recharging that recharges in 2 hours at a station that costs $30,000 or $40,000 for the equipment to recharge a vehicle that costs $60,000 or $80,000. So that's not what we're talking about with the city. We're talking about pickup trucks and vans and the occasional smaller vehicle. We've got 8 of the Bolts out there now, which could be considered compact vehicles that we use in the pool and to deliver mail and for inspectors, that type of thing. And those recharging stations are in the $5,000 to $12,000 a piece category. And then they recharge those vehicles in 7 to 8 hours, so they're overnight cycles. So we can't take vehicles that are 24/7 vehicles and use that type of infrastructure for. But the industry has matured to the point. I mean, California's been doing this, I guess, almost 20 years now. So they've gone through a lot of the growing pains with it on both coasts. So we're not jumping in at the bleeding edge. We're jumping into things that are proven technology and proven standards. And so now that Ford and GM are both producing vehicles in their factories like this, they're not handmade ones like Tesla is, and they recharge at a full shift to do it, then those chargers, called Type 2 chargers, they will do it a single shift. They're much more economical. And so we put them at our facilities where those vehicles will be parked overnight anyway, and then recharge them there. And so the infrastructure is being considered as part of the fuel cost, as well as the electricity going there when we look at the life cycle cost of it.
Okay, I was just wanted to make sure that as we spend funds that we don't end up something going obsolete within the next couple of years and you have to replace it with something else and that kind of thing. That was more my question as opposed to.
Well, I think what the key factor is there is that it became economical to do because Ford and GM started producing vehicles that fleets and the average person would want to use. And the battery technology improved enough that you can get 200, 250 miles range out of them. So these aren't hobby vehicles anymore. But the reason why GM and Ford did that is because the current federal administration passed executive ruling that 30% of the federal fleet, which is 400,000 vehicles, needed to be electric, and they set the deadline in the 30s. So it basically kickstarted the whole thing, made everything a higher quantity of vehicles being produced. Same thing for the chargers. So just like that's what started it all, if that continues, then foreseeable future is that everything we're investing today will continue to be viable economically and continue to work operationally into the next 10, 15 years, which
Right.
is the life cycle of what we're doing.
Okay.
Unfortunately, if the rules for the federal fleet change, then it could go completely the opposite direction.
Well, yeah, I mean that's sort of a given, but I was more interested just in the term that we're talking about, whether or not that was it. And I think you answered my question, but thanks. Okay,
Okay.
in terms of how did you want to proceed? I've got the total rolling stock needs inventory, that pivot table that you've got, which I can pull up, or did you want to go to the vehicle replacement list?
Let's do the inventory because that'll give them a better picture of what's going on out there. And since it shows all the critical vehicles as well, then they can see what types of vehicles we're talking about.
Okay.
So there are a couple of points. Well, Paul,
Can you see that on my screen now?
I'm looking at the inventory, the vehicle by vehicle list now on your screen. Need the PDF that is the pivot table.
Okay,
has
let me stop share and I'll share again and I'll pull that up again. So.
Okay.
Let's see, where is
Well, the
that?
most important point I want to make about the fleet is you deliberate what you think is a good expenditure and what's not.
How about now?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
So these vehicles are tools to perform services. There aren't any perks involved. The days of people taking vehicles home because of who they were or what position they had is over. So, and has been for the last 20 years. So now the only vehicles that go home are the ones that are required to be on call. They're almost all fire and police vehicles. The few that aren't are technician type vehicles that have to be on call to deal with electrical emergencies or HVAC emergencies or that type of thing. So we're talking about workhorse vehicles here. And this list is organized by department, then by vehicle category, so like crew trucks small, crew trucks large, that type of thing. And then it shows you how many total units there are and what the fleet value of that is. How many of those that we have are in need of replacement, meaning they've hit that 10-year, 15-year, sometimes 30-year if they're off-road equipment, target replacement time. And then of those needing a replacement, how many of those are currently critical? And in order so you can know, because sometimes it takes us 18 months to 2 years from the time funding is approved until the vehicles get here, that next column already funded shows what is in the works right now. By and large, they're ones that have been approved within the last, well, the oldest approval money we have that hasn't been delivered yet is we have a few FY21 vehicles that are not delivered, but almost everything else are 23s and 24s. So if you go all the way to the bottom page, we'll talk about totals for a minute, and then a couple of problem areas, and then I'd like to answer questions. So if you look at this, then of the vehicles that are eligible for capital funding because they are expensive enough and last long enough, 1,800 of those. So the total fleet, and remember, this doesn't include water and airport and a few of the county offices like Treasurer's office. But it does include fire and police. $241 million worth in that 1,800 vehicles. Of those, almost 72 million of it needs to be replaced. So that is a third of the fleet is at or beyond its usable life, and to the point where, well, I don't know how you are, but I wouldn't let my kids drive it to college 2 hours away or rely on that vehicle making it through an entire shift of picking up trash. I mean, sometimes we have refuse drivers take a trash truck out and they go through 2 and 3 of them in a day because they're not reliable enough. Now, that's only, again, a third of them. So 2/3 of them are fine. But a third of them are actually causing operational problems. And of those, the critical ones are the ones that are 5 years or more overdue. So that makes up another 36, well, that's 36 million of the 71 million that is actually in the critical category. So if there isn't $36 million to spend on vehicles, which there isn't, I don't think there's $36 million to spend on everything together, including facilities and local match for federal funds and all that kind of thing, then you have to decide what percentage of that you want to replace. By looking at what's critical on the list above it, you can tell that, you know, if police are almost in good shape, except for those few vehicles that need to be plussed up for detective purposes, and the fire department is down to the point where they've got 80 trucks and all but 2 of them are in good shape, not in the critical category, then everything else is the public works type fleet, the street vehicles, the refuse vehicles, the traffic vehicles, parks, the forestry. Those are the big parts of the fleet that have a lot of equipment. And if they don't have that equipment, then their crews can't perform the services. You may remember a few years ago, it hasn't been that long ago, I guess now, but, you know, grass got knee high in most of the parks because we didn't have enough tractors and out front mowers to cut the grass. It wasn't the staffing, and it wasn't that people weren't wanting to do it. It was they didn't have the equipment to do it with. If refuse doesn't get picked up on schedule, then for the last 2 months, we've been pretty good about having a truck for every driver that's running a route. But there was a time just within the last 3 or 4 years when there were not enough trucks for every driver, and so your trash not getting picked up or mine not getting picked up might have been because there just weren't enough trucks. If we have one snow like we had this year, then it's no problem for streets to put the snow call on. But if we have ones that have 5 or 6 major snows, then trying to put 60 trucks on the street would be next to impossible at this point. The paving program, which got a good boost in the ARPA program, doing all the north-south roads, $15 million worth of paving to do, but the paving equipment is to the point where they can only operate 1 crew at a time, and if they have a major failure in a big piece of $500,000 equipment, then that operation will get stalled in the middle of it and may be down for a week or 2 while we're trying to fix the equipment, get parts from Germany, you know, for the equipment, or for the paver from Argentina. So this stuff is made all over the world at this point. And if you don't have reliable frontline equipment and decent backup equipment, it creates an operational problem. So when you look at these vehicles that are involved, don't think of them as something that's nice to have. Think of them as, if these vehicles are not there, then the crews that are for the operating divisions can't do these jobs, and we won't see the services that we're expecting as citizens. So I'm not going to try to tell you you should spend $30 million on public works vehicles. I know it's not there. I know it's not possible. But you have to understand that the operating costs for maintaining the garages, buying parts, and taking care of vehicle breakdowns is, while it may be evident that that's part of the problem with scout vehicles in the police department, that's not the problem at all in any of these other areas. It's just that the equipment is worn out. And so with the rare instance of a driver not doing what he's supposed to do, most of the downtime we have is not bad behavior. It is just that should have been replaced at 8 years and we're still trying to use it at 15. That's what it comes down to. I've got a nearly full staff of technicians who work solid and are very good at what we do. And there are days when we can't keep up and have a backlog of a week or so, even at full staff. And it's just because the vehicles have to be replaced. And at some point, no matter how much money you throw at fixing them, you can't keep them on the road. And you have to say, well, enough is enough. We're not going to throw any more money down this hole. And the vehicle has to be retired and gone. So that is the situation. As depressing as that is, makes me sound like Eeyore. As depressing as that situation is, that is what we're facing. So we will continue to do the best we can with what tools we have. We will continue to keep as much of this old stuff on the street as we can, as long as it remains safe. If it gets to the point where, you know, the chassis are rusting and cracking, they're not safe. It gets to the point where we're dripping more hydraulic fluid down the road and alleys than we're keeping in the trucks in order to pick up trash and to plow streets and to fix potholes and cut trees, then we'll have to take them off the road, because we're not going to create environmental problems, and we're not going to put up with fleet safety problems under any circumstances. But beyond that, we'll do the best we can. So that's my pitch, and I would love to answer any questions you might have.
Well, let me jump in real quick, Chris. So do you want to explain how so knowing just what Chris presented, basically you got this big long list of needs across the various departments, and we know we can't fund it all. So typically what we do is we ask Chris to coordinate with departments and develop a priority list. So we know we don't have in any given year, $30 or $40 million to throw at vehicles. Let's say we've got 5 or 10. We ask him to prioritize replacements, and so that's typically what he does. And I can share that screen. That was the earlier screen I had, and that's what this is.
And that's a preliminary list.
Right.
Whenever we get the funding, we'll draw the line in the list. And then my process is that I will talk to the operating departments and my fellow commissioners, and I will say, okay, what is the most important of all this stuff that we need to replace? We don't even have enough money for all the critical vehicles. So if we can't replace it all, then what is it that you need to perform the most services that you can? Then I take their list of the capital priorities and I take it to the managers of the garages that work for me, and I say, okay, so what of this list can you not keep running no matter how much money you spend on it for the next 2 to 3 years? And if you're going to invest $30,000 into an $80,000 truck, that if we sold it today at auction, we would be lucky to get $2,000 for it. You know, what would that be in order to keep as many operational vehicles on the street as you can? And then ultimately, I make the selections based upon the input from the operating departments and the recommendations from my staff about what they can and can't fix. And I make those recommendations to the capital committee. And I tell them, if you can only spare $1 million, this is what we're going to buy. If you can spare 5, this is what we're going to buy. If you can spare 10 or 15 or whatever you can spare, we'll get the most bang for our buck out of it. And then we'll fix everything else that we can, and the stuff we can't replace and we can't fix, then you have to plan on those being holes in the current fleet that we won't have available to use for operational tools. So I'm responsible for keeping as many of them on the road safely as I can. And I either have to get it replaced, or I have to get it repaired, or I have to take it out of the fleet because it's unsafe. That's really the choices that I have. And so your recommendation will decide how much of the pie that is available gets spent on this, as opposed to buildings and roads and bridges and repaving streets and upgrading pools and changing recreation centers and everything else that has to be done. I've had the privilege of sitting on the capital committee meetings for the better part of the 30 years that I've been Commissioner of Equipment Services. And I see that committee have to face nearly impossible decisions every year. There just is not enough money to go around, and things continue to cost more money. And so you're one cog in that. You get to decide what you think is the most important. And all I wanted you to do is to be aware of the scope of the issue and what services are involved with the vehicles. So it's a little more personal than just looking at a list of vehicles and just thinking that, well, we don't need to spend money on police cars because they'll just wreck them anyway. Because maybe a dozen of them will get wrecked during the year. And maybe 10 of those 12 will be perfectly understandable. And 2 of them won't be, and the officers will get fired, but we still have to have the vehicles to put on the street to do the job. So that's my appeal to you, is just keep in mind what it is these produce operationally when you're deciding how much you want to put where. So
Okay,
that's
thanks.
all I have to say.
No, great. That's very helpful and gives us some context in terms of that need that's out there. And obviously, it's a big one. Let's get to some of the questions in the chats. In the purchase of, this is from Todd, in the purchase of the vehicles, are any minority or women-owned dealerships taken into consideration?
Well, there are targets for minority and women-owned businesses, but there are very few of the vehicle sales, like the company that has won the fire engine sales, which is the dealership for Schmiel, is a women-owned business. And a lot of the companies that provide, like the fuel that we use, is a women-owned business. And there are several others that are there. I don't know of any of them that have won the bids that are minority-owned businesses, but we certainly would be happy to do business with them if we did. Now, some of them that do things like repair tires and repair body work and those types of things for non-police vehicles, which we have our own body shop for, those are minority-owned businesses. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many of them are or aren't. But what I can tell you is that everything is done based upon competitive bidding. And if they can provide the service and they can do so at a reasonable price, then we're happy to do business with them.
And Chris, just to add on to that, those contracts, the bids for these vehicles are all through the supply division and all through supply process, correct?
That's correct.
Thank
Equipment
you.
Services doesn't bid anything, but we decide what we need, and we will help evaluate what the bids are. So we make sure that we have something that will work and is going to be safe and is a good investment for us. And as to whether or not what type of business they are and what the percentages are, those are things that I don't have responsibility for, but also don't have a problem with.
Okay. Katie's got a question. It would be helpful to know in future years how our fleet turnover compares to other similar cities.
Well, most cities that are like us, which we're a second-tier city in terms of population and fleet size, and then places like Chicago, a first-tier city, they might be, where we're talking about 3,700 vehicles, they might have 3,700 fire engines, them in New York and places like that. And so other places like Kansas City, Indianapolis, Louisville, Midwest, mid-sized cities have similar issues. They have an infrastructure that needs a lot of work, and they have all the same operational requirements for all the common services that citizens need and expect. And so it is a challenge for everybody that is one of my peers to deal with these issues every year. And it's not getting any better. In some years it gets worse. Like we got a little bit well in the late 90s when the economy was doing better in general. And a lot of the fleet got well in the 2000 model year with refuse trucks and fire engines and practically everything else. But then everything has been pretty much downhill since then, just because the economy and the availability of funding has been a problem. In addition to doing my job here at the city, one of my volunteer jobs was I spent 14 years on the board of the Fleet Profession, NAFA, not NAPA, but NAFA, Fleet Management Association. So I'm well acquainted with what my peers are experiencing. And we did some benchmarking studies with them, and we continue to do it with Kansas City. And unfortunately, the situation is very similar for all of us. The only people that don't have a problem are the ones that are in growing, expanding economies. Like for a while, that was places like Atlanta that was expanding. They're bigger than we are. And places like Las Vegas that had an expanding economy. But even places like that have all slowed down to this point where they have more services to provide than they have money available to do it with. So it's a pretty bleak picture for middle-sized cities that have infrastructure that is older and whose economies are not growing. Now, there are all kinds of things that other departments of the city and the mayor's office and the comptroller and the alderman work on to try to improve the financial picture for the city of St. Louis. Paul Payne right here has those answers such as they are. And I think they do a good job of keeping their eye on the prize and what is important and what is not important. What I can say is that in the 30 years I've been privileged to be a commissioner with the city, I have not seen a lot of things that I thought were not absolutely essential. There's some things that are less important than others that get done, but just because I think they're less important doesn't mean they actually are. I think that's one of the reasons why a committee like this one is a good one, because you have a perspective that you can share with the decision makers that are deciding what's important and what's not. And the fact is that there are over $500 million worth of critical needs for capital that the capital committee and then the board of E&A and then the board of aldermen have to face. And they need good advice to decide what's important enough to fund and what is not. I told the capital committee last month when they met that I don't envy them having to make these decisions because they are difficult. And no matter what they decide, something important doesn't get done.
Okay, thanks, Chris. The next question from JP, how much does our refuse fee defray fleet costs? I believe it stands at $14 per unit at present. Yeah, what JP is referring to is the refuse collection fee that this city charges, which is at $14 currently. When, I don't know if you recall, when the fee was increased from $11 to $14, a portion of those revenues were specifically allocated toward fleet replacement. And it was at $1.8 million, which for a time actually covered what we were replacing in the refuse fleet. Although that was about 7 years ago, and the cost of replacing the refuse truck has gone up significantly since then. So yeah, to answer your question, JP, $1.8 million was set aside specifically for fleet replacement when it went up that last time. And that has been over those years specifically allocated towards fleet replacement, although it has not caught up. It has not been it has not kept up with the cost of the increasing cost of replacing the fleet vehicles.
All that's exactly correct. The last $3 fee that went, a big portion of it for capital replacement of refuse trucks, made it possible for us to get from trucks that average 15 years down to trucks that are averaging 12 years. Like the oldest trucks we have in the fleet right now that we're expecting to run every day are 2013s. Now that's still 11 years old, and the objective replacement time on them is 8 years. And so anything past the 8 years is meaning that we are making major investments through the repair budget that offsets the lack of capital. So when that was keeping up, trucks cost about $215,000 to $220,000, depending on whether they were alley pickup or cart trucks. Now alley trucks are costing $330,000, and cart trucks are costing closer to $350,000. So it doesn't stretch as far as it used to, but it is still a major help. And if we didn't have that, I suspect we wouldn't be picking up trash at half of the houses that we are now.
Right. Okay, next question, and this is from JP again. I think this is a follow-up to an earlier conversation we had. Can you help me understand something? I know the city is self-insured. A few weeks ago, I asked if fire stations would be consolidated, and Rich said the insurance we have on the house requires a certain distance operational effectiveness, so we're not looking to consolidate at this time. When we asked about our insurance policy on our police fleet, it's been simply explained as the city is self-insured and determines the policy. Can you reconcile? I think what this is referencing is to the insurance rating of the city, not the insurance policy that the city has. There's a rating that the city gets for its overall fire protection coverage. So if you're a business that's located within the city, you are acknowledged to be, oh, you're in a city that has this sort of rating for fire protection services. That's not the same as the city being what the city's insurance policy is, that we're self-insured. I don't know, Rich, did you have anything else on that? I think that's the difference.
No, it's a difference. That's the ISO ratings that the fire department does, and the businesses, and you know how old our vehicles are, the locations of the house, the response time. That is a whole different animal than the insurance that we have.
That's sort of what I was thinking, JP.
But Dennis was working on that a few years ago. The agent that was talking about the study basically said that if our insurance rating was worse than it is, that all of us and all the businesses would be paying more for our home insurance and for our business insurance for fire coverage. So it doesn't directly affect the city so much as it affects everybody doing business and owning homes in the city.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, that's mostly residents and businesses who are located in that city, and they say, okay, what's your ISO rating, and that's how that feeds into the rates. Thanks. Okay. I think that's the last of the questions we have here for fleet. So, and we're coming up on the top of the hour now. So, so this was the last of the presentations that we had scheduled for this series of Citizen Advisory Committee meetings. And I had one scheduled I tentatively for next week, but I'm thinking where we need to go. At least I'd like to hear from all of you. And then and we've done this in the past. And so rather than having a scheduled meeting next week, what I'd like to be able to do, I've developed this in the past. Not all of you were on the previous meetings before, but I've put together a survey to solicit your input into the various items on this list, as well as anything that you think that we haven't really covered. Or it gives you the opportunity to say, no, I think this is very important. Let's say the rec centers or pools or in the past, Soulard or the streets, particular streets, or this vehicle discussion we just had, or something else that we haven't discussed about, and that we should consider. And so what I'd like to be able to do, and probably send out tomorrow to you, is basically it's on a Google sheet, and it's a survey that allows you to say, here's your input, and so that we can compile that. And I would like to have it compiled by, I think I'll give you till, I think it's like next week, sometime Wednesday or so that by next Thursday, I don't believe we'll have a meeting next Thursday, but I do want to be able to circulate to all of you what you all are the results of that survey, just to see where you are, so that we can get that information to the capital committee as a whole. So you should be hearing from us on that hopefully tomorrow. I notice my secretary's out, so we'll figure out how to get that out to you tomorrow. But we'll do that. And so now with that, I'd like to thank you all again participating this evening. Is there anything else for the common good that we need to consider? Anyone? Great. Well, thank you. And again, you should probably be hearing from us tomorrow on this survey that we're going to be issuing out, and to get your input back for us. But again, thank you again for this evening's participation, and you'll be hearing from us shortly. Good night, all.